Forgotten bridges, the silent arteries of the medieval world, building across rivers. When you picture the Middle Ages, you might think of castles looming over hills, cathedrals reaching toward the heavens, or knights riding into battle. But another, quieter feature of the medieval world deserves attention: bridges. They may not stir the imagination in the same way as shining armor or stained glass, but bridges were essential. They allowed people, animals, and carts to cross rivers. They connected markets to villages, and they sustained the lifeblood of commerce and pilgrimage. And yet, the story of medieval bridges is not one of engineering marvels alone, but of patient construction, community effort, endless maintenance, and the dull rhythm of tolls collected day after day. To understand the Middle Ages, you must imagine not just kings and bishops, but also masons laying stones in muddy riverbeds, peasants dragging timbers into place, and travelers handing over coins at creaking wooden gates. The challenge of rivers. Rivers were both lifelines and obstacles. They provided water, food, and transport, but they also divided communities. For a farmer carrying grain to market, a swollen river could mean a day's delay or even disaster. For merchants moving goods, reliable crossings were as important as roads themselves. Early medieval Europe relied heavily on ferries, rafts, and simple fords, shallow places where carts and animals could wade across. But these crossings were unreliable, especially during floods. A stone bridge, once built, offered permanence. Yet building such a structure was costly, labor-intensive, and technically difficult. Who built the bridges? Contrary to what you might expect, it was not always kings who ordered bridges built. Often, responsibility fell to local lords, bishops, or even communities of villagers. Sometimes monastic orders took the lead, seeing bridge building as an act of piety, a way to ease the journeys of pilgrims or to save travelers from drowning. In southern France, religious brotherhoods known as frères pontifes, or bridge-building fraternities, dedicated themselves to this quiet labor. Funding came from a variety of sources. Wealthy patrons might donate money or land. Towns might levy special taxes. In many cases, bridges were built with the expectation of toll collection. Each traveler who crossed contributed a small fee, which supported the bridge's upkeep. For ordinary people, these tolls were frustrating but familiar. To cross was to pay. To pay was to participate in the endless maintenance of medieval infrastructure, materials, and techniques. The earliest medieval bridges were often wooden, constructed from heavy timbers laid across stone piers. These bridges were quicker to build but prone to decay. Floods, fire, and rot could destroy them within decades. Stone bridges, though far more durable, demanded greater resources. To build a stone bridge, masons first sank foundations into the riverbed, often using wooden cofferdams to hold back water. Stone piers were then raised, topped with arches carefully fitted to distribute weight. Finally, the roadway was laid, sometimes paved with cobblestones, other times left as rough planks. The work was slow. Rivers shifted, floods interrupted, and local laborers had to be conscripted or hired. Yet once completed, a stone bridge could endure for centuries, becoming a permanent fixture in the landscape. Many medieval bridges, though battered, still stand today. Toll collection. Crossing a bridge was rarely free. Tolls were collected at gates or small booths at either end. A clerk or guard sat inside, noting who passed and collecting fees in coin, goods, or even services. Toll rates varied. Merchants with carts of goods paid more than peasants on foot, and sometimes exemptions were granted for clergy or local residents. To modern ears, toll collection may sound like a nuisance, but it was essential. Without revenue, bridges could not be maintained. Repairs were constant. Floods scoured piers. Wheels broke stones loose, and wooden elements rotted. The toll system ensured a steady trickle of income, boring though it was. The records of tolls, where they survive, are strikingly mundane. They list travelers by category: 1 cart of hay, 2 pigs, 3 merchants with cloth. These lists remind us that bridges were not abstract symbols of connection, but very real passages where animals, goods, and people shuffled slowly across, day after day. Bridges as community spaces. Bridges were not only for crossing. In many towns, they became places of gathering. Shops, chapels, even houses were sometimes built upon them. The famous London Bridge once supported rows of timbered buildings, crowded with shops and homes. Smaller bridges sometimes held a chapel at the center, where travelers could pause to pray for safe journeys. These additions made bridges vibrant, if noisy, spaces. The creak of carts, the calls of merchants, the toll keeper's shouts, all echoed across the arches. For the people who lived nearby, the bridge was both infrastructure and community center, symbolism and faith. In the medieval imagination, bridges also carried symbolic weight. To build a bridge was a work of mercy, likened to saving souls by providing safe passage. Charters for bridge building often emphasized the spiritual merit of the task. Donors were promised prayers, indulgences, or commemoration in return for their gifts. Pilgrims especially valued bridges. A safe crossing meant the difference between reaching a shrine or being stranded by flood. For this reason, monasteries along pilgrimage routes often invested in bridge construction, seeing it as part of their duty of hospitality. Reflection. The image of a bridge in the Middle Ages is less about grandeur than about persistence. Each stone laid into a river was an act of endurance. Each toll collected an act of maintenance. The work was boring, the records repetitive, but the outcome shaped daily life in profound ways. As you picture a mason lowering stones into a muddy riverbed, or a toll keeper scratching figures into a parchment ledger, you might wonder, how did these humble crossings, built with such effort, survive the centuries? And what do the bridges themselves remember of the countless feet, hooves, and wheels that passed across them day after day? Life on the bridges, maintenance, disputes, and everyday crossings. Once a bridge was completed, it did not stand forever in perfect condition. In fact, the true challenge of medieval bridges was not their construction, but their maintenance. A bridge left untended would quickly succumb to the wear of wheels, hooves, floods, and frost. Thus, across medieval Europe, a quiet cycle repeated itself: building, repairing, collecting, disputing. Each bridge became not only a structure of stone or wood, but a living part of its community, bound up in the endless routine of upkeep and negotiation. The wear of time. Every day, carts rumbled across bridges, iron-rimmed wheels striking stones loose. Hooves chipped at the surface, and rain seeped into cracks. In winter, frost expanded in tiny crevices, widening them into fractures. In spring, floods tore at piers, eroding the foundations. Wooden bridges decayed even faster, rot setting into beams, joints loosening, planks snapping under heavy loads. It was not uncommon for bridges to collapse under strain. Chroniclers sometimes recorded dramatic accidents, but for the most part, collapse was simply another reminder of the ongoing struggle against nature. Every bridge was temporary, every crossing precarious unless constant effort went into its repair. Toll revenues and repairs. Repairs were financed through tolls. At either end of many bridges, a small booth or gatehouse collected fees. The amounts were carefully recorded. A few coins for a horse, more for a cart, sometimes in-kind payments like grain or firewood. These revenues were supposed to fund laborers and masons to patch stones, replace timbers, and dredge riverbeds around piers. But the system was imperfect. At times, toll revenues were diverted by local lords for their own uses. In other cases, tolls were too low to cover actual expenses, leaving bridges to deteriorate until collapse forced costly rebuilding. The dull paperwork of toll collection, ledgers filled with figures, names, and goods, was as important as the construction itself. Without those records, the bridge could not sustain itself. Disputes over rights. Bridges also became flashpoints for disputes. Who had the right to collect tolls? Who was responsible for repairs? Was the bridge the property of the town, the local lord, or the church that had sponsored its construction? Legal records from medieval Europe are full of such disputes. A monastery might claim it had built the bridge and therefore held the right to tolls. A town council might argue that its citizens had provided labor, making the bridge communal property. Lords often sought to claim tolls as part of their feudal rights, even if they had contributed little to the actual work. These disputes could drag on for years, filling court rolls with repetitive arguments and testimonies. For the traveler waiting to cross, however, the dispute mattered little. Tolls were paid regardless, and repairs, delayed or not, had to be made eventually. The people of the bridge. Bridges were not only functional but inhabited spaces. Toll keepers lived in small houses or booths at the ends of bridges, their lives marked by the endless rhythm of collecting fees. Some bridges, especially in towns, supported shops built directly on their spans. Butchers, fishmongers, and cloth sellers crowded narrow passageways, their stalls adding noise and congestion. In larger towns, bridges became miniature communities. London Bridge famously supported rows of houses and even a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Becket. Other bridges hosted chapels at their center, where travelers could pause to pray for safe passage. Living on a bridge was both opportunity and burden. Shopkeepers benefited from constant foot traffic, but the noise and danger of collapse loomed. Toll keepers endured long, monotonous hours, recording payments in all seasons, fending off disputes, and repairing booths battered by weather. Rituals and symbolism. Crossing a bridge carried symbolic weight. Travelers sometimes cast coins into the water for good fortune. Pilgrims often stopped at chapels built upon bridges, offering prayers before continuing their journeys. Some bridges became sites of processions or ceremonies, linking sacred and secular life. Bridge building itself retained religious associations. Endowments for bridge repair were often framed as pious donations, with spiritual rewards promised to benefactors. For the poor, labor on a bridge might count as a form of penance. Thus, the humdrum work of masonry and toll collection carried undertones of salvation and morality. Everyday crossings. Despite their symbolic layers, bridges were above all practical. Each day saw a steady flow of people, peasants with baskets of vegetables, merchants with carts of cloth, shepherds driving sheep, nobles on horseback, beggars limping along with staffs. Each left faint traces in the toll ledgers: one cart of hay, 2 pigs, 3 cloth merchants. For most, the crossing was routine. Bridges were not destinations, but transitions, spaces between. Yet in their very routine lay their importance. The silent, steady traffic across bridges bound villages to markets, pilgrims to shrines, armies to campaigns. The constant struggle of maintenance. The monotony of bridge maintenance deserves emphasis. Masons patched stones. Carpenters replaced beams. Laborers dredged riverbeds. Toll keepers submitted ledgers to officials who compared revenues with expenses. When floods struck, repairs began anew. Charters sometimes granted exemptions from tolls to encourage traffic, but these exemptions often reduced revenue, forcing new appeals for donations. Thus, maintenance was never solved, only managed. Bridges were perpetually incomplete, always in the process of wearing down and being patched up again. Reflection. As you imagine a medieval bridge, do not picture a perfect arch spanning a river for eternity. Instead, picture a structure constantly patched, tolled, disputed, and repaired. Think of the toll keeper hunched in a booth, recording each crossing. Think of the mason hammering loose stones back into place. Think of the endless shuffle of feet, hooves, and wheels. The grandeur of castles and cathedrals often overshadows these structures, but without bridges, markets could not function, armies could not move, and communities remained divided. And yet, one wonders, if so much effort went into their care, how many bridges were simply abandoned when the costs grew too great? How many rivers, once bridged, fell back into silence as their crossings decayed? Decline, abandonment, and the legacy of bridges. If the life of a bridge was one of constant repair and dispute, it is no surprise that many did not last. For every medieval bridge that still arches across a river today, Dozens more collapsed, rotted, or were quietly abandoned. Yet their memory lingered in names, in records, and in the faint traces of piers seen when waters run low. Collapse and ruin. The fate of most medieval bridges was predictable: collapse. Floods were the most common culprit. A swollen river could batter piers until they cracked, carrying away entire spans in a single night. Chroniclers sometimes recorded these events with grim fascination. Villages stranded, carts washed downstream, toll houses swept away. Other bridges decayed slowly. Wooden beams rotted, one plank at a time, until the structure became unsafe. Stone arches might crumble under centuries of frost and thaw. For travelers, a ruined bridge was both inconvenience and danger. Some crossings reverted to ferries or fords, undoing decades of labor. Abandonment and substitution. Sometimes bridges were simply abandoned. If toll revenues declined, or if wars devastated a region, the costs of maintenance could outweigh the benefits. A village might decide it was easier to use a ferry than to rebuild. A lord might divert funds to a castle instead of a crossing. Over time, the abandoned bridge slipped from use. Its stones scavenged for other buildings. Yet even when abandoned, bridges left marks. Place names across Europe still recall vanished structures. Pontus Ruptus, Broken Bridge, Old Bridge Meadow, or Ponte Vecchio, the Old Bridge, sometimes long gone by the time the name was recorded. These names preserve the memory of crossings no longer visible. Bridges in war. Bridges also suffered in war. To block invading armies, defenders sometimes destroyed their own bridges, cutting off routes across rivers. Invaders burned or dismantled them to slow pursuit. Thus, the strategic importance of bridges, so crucial in peacetime commerce, also made them targets in conflict. After war, communities faced choices: rebuild quickly to restore trade, or leave the river to ferries until funds and labor could be gathered again. For toll keepers and masons, war meant both destruction and opportunity. New contracts for rebuilding, new disputes over rights, new ledgers to fill. Survivors through maintenance. And yet, some bridges endured. Their survival was not due to luck, but to relentless maintenance. Town councils allocated funds each year for repairs. Brotherhoods and guilds dedicated themselves to upkeep. Monasteries kept revenues flowing to ensure safe passage for pilgrims. These bridges became landmarks, familiar to generations. They marked the landscape, tied towns to trade routes, and outlived the lords and bishops who had first ordered them built. Their endurance was less a miracle than a testament to steady, boring effort. The patching of stones, the collection of tolls, the recording of accounts. Bridges as memory. Even ruined bridges became part of collective memory. Travelers wrote about collapsed spans. Poets used broken bridges as metaphors for lost connections, and chroniclers noted them as signs of neglect or divine punishment. Archaeology confirms these memories. In riverbeds, divers have found foundations of piers long submerged. In fields near rivers, villagers still plowed around heaps of stone that once anchored crossings. These remains, though silent, remind us of the countless lives that once moved across them, the boring records that preserve them. What we know of medieval bridges often comes not from the bridges themselves, but from the records around them. Toll ledgers, repair accounts, legal disputes, charters granting funds. A toll roll might list hundreds of crossings in a month. 2 pigs, 1 cart of hay, 3 merchants with cloth. A repair account might detail 20 stones purchased, 3 masons employed, 2 carpenters for beams. These lists are tedious to read but invaluable. They show us how much a community spent, who labored, and what passed over the bridge each day. Such records are not dramatic, but they reveal the texture of life in a way no monument can. The legacy in modern times. Many medieval bridges still stand, carrying cars where once they carried carts. Others lie in ruins, picturesque arches crumbling into streams. Still others survive only in records and place names. Their legacy is quiet but profound. Bridges tied medieval communities together. They made markets possible, supported pilgrimage, and allowed armies to move. They also became symbols of mercy and piety, embodiments of endurance and connection. Today, when you cross an old stone bridge, you are walking on centuries of repair, labor, toll collection, and dispute. The bridge is not just an object, but a palimpsest of human effort, layered stone by stone, record by record. Reflection. As you picture a ruined bridge with moss-covered stones, or a toll ledger filled with repetitive lists, you begin to see the Middle Ages not only in castles and cathedrals, but in these quieter arteries of life. Bridges were built, patched, told, disputed, collapsed, and rebuilt again and again across centuries. And so one wonders, were bridges truly about crossing rivers, or were they about something deeper? Were they symbols of persistence in the face of decay, reminders that human effort is always temporary, yet always renewed?